Eric, we are joined here today by you, me, and that's all that really matters because it seems individuals have really, truly been enjoying the episodes recently. It might be our bias reading the comments on the YouTube and the Instagram DMs, but it seems like they've been enjoying these episodes.
Yeah, I tell you what, I get the same impression. When I go through and systematically delete all the negative comments on YouTube and
Right.
Instagram, and then I read the comments, it's
Whew.
just to see a positivity. And that's not my bias speaking. That's just reality as I
Yeah.
see it after actively manipulating it. So no, I want to thank all the people who've been giving us some positive feedback. You know, two things, Omar, regarding positive feedback.
Yep.
Because I got two hands, so I can pat myself on two things on the back simultaneously. All right. So number one is that we got a lot of really positive feedback on our metabolism myths episode. So what that tells me is that one, as I get old, now that I'm 38, and Omar gets to an indeterminate age that always looks the same, but we know he's older because time has passed. It seems that our audience is aging as well.
Right.
Even though the age only shows up on my face and not Omar's.
No.
Don't
Eric,
even deny it. Listen,
no,
you're
no,
a vampire,
Eric, stop.
and it's okay.
Eric's actually gonna have Brandon delete it. It's like because Eric knows I'm gonna. It's not me swinging in your favor, Eric. It's me just telling you the objective. Your subjective experience does not reflect the objective reality. You're a beautiful man,
yes.
my friend. I'm done.
Yeah.
I know I could derail this whole episode if you want right here, Eric. I could. I could do it.
Look, how about this? I accept that I'm a beautiful man.
Sure.
I would say that I look a little more distinguished than I used to. Will you give me that?
Love that word. Yeah, distinguished is great. Yes.
Okay, cool. But you haven't aged at all. But reality indicates that people normally, besides Omar, do age with the passage of time. As we talked about, we've both been doing the damn thing for over a decade on the interwebs, which means our audience might also be getting older, which is maybe why they were actually so interested and gave us so much feedback on the Metabolism Myths episode. And we got a lot of questions related to, okay, well, that's really cool. I didn't know that about the metabolism, but tangentially, you talked a little bit about strength, hypertrophy, and just what you can accomplish as you age as a lifter. But do we have hard empirical data on more specific elements of health, fitness, body composition, not just energy expenditure, but what can I expect as a lifter who's getting older? When will I likely hit my peak? How long can I sustain it for? And when is it really downhill? So that's number one. Thank you for that feedback. We're gonna do a dovetail off that episode today. But number two, for those of you who appreciated last week's episode, and we got a ton of positive comments, I will say most of the positive comments came from people who not just listened to the episode, but watched. So if you think you're a die-hard cult fan and you're on iTunes or Spotify right now, I'm not going to say I don't appreciate you because I appreciate you, but you're missing half of the sensory experience that is Iron Culture. And do me a favor, and for at least the first 5 minutes of last episode, I want you to watch the Connor Heffernan episode on the injury-related myths about the squat. Just the first 5 minutes, and everything will make sense. And not only that, I guarantee you'll have an amazingly happy day after doing so.
No, Eric, I concur 100%. He's a great spud. I got to say, with him, you really get to the root of any issue. And you could see where a lot of the myths stem from when it came to squatting low and how squatting low was bad for you. So he's at the tippity top of the Iron Cult guest list. I do want to read because here's the thing. I am being serious here. I told Eric I shared a little bit of the good news because I'm in Canada. Eric's in New Zealand. And I said, Eric, we're ranked number 153 this week on, the Apple iTunes algorithm. Oh, hey, corporate conglomerate overlords, thanks. But it is a feat. Honestly, I'm not even joking because we're averaging 30,000 downloads. We did reject, and this is a true story. I could only do this. Let me state this verbally out loud I could only do this podcast with Eric because we were both approached. This is a true story, and I'll keep bringing it up. We were approached by a very large corporation to become exclusive with our podcast because they have intense systems to analyze who's up and coming, like what different angles, genres, so like health and fitness, all these other things. Anyways, we were given an offer to be exclusive. And I'm laughing because I think 99% of people probably would have accepted it. It would have been seen as an upward mobility move. And we said no, because the idea of the exclusivity and some of the entrapments that people might not be aware of, where you're being financially compensated. Eric and myself are very comfortable losing money. We like to call it a passion project. And so they gave us a tantalizing offer that I think anyone else would have accepted. And that is what makes me so comfortable about the cult, Eric, and what we do, is that we talk about the issues that we think would interest the listeners. Sometimes, and that's just to touch on the Connor episode, someone said essentially that just the title of the episode, like history, narrative myths, I didn't think I'd be interested, and I was pleasantly astounded. And that's kind of routinely, when we mix our content, we know what people want to see, not what would get clicks, but let's face it, these large topics that interest a lot of people, and then some of the hardcore, like we are that group of artists that we got the gems on the albums, right? That the true hardcore people really appreciate. And sometimes over time, like I think this episode, with this almost, it's the onset of an existential crisis for certain potentially members of the cult, talking about your theoretical peak, where it might be, and that there is the concept, because not that we're naively optimistic as lifters, but we like to believe, the perpetual process of self-improvement, which doesn't preclude the possibility that at some point there is that peak. But we're going to talk about everything. Eric, if you'll allow me real quick, I do want to read some of the positive feedback. I couldn't find the negative. And that's not because, that is not because I wasn't seeking out. In fact, you know me, I seek out the controversy. I think it's because someone went into our account beforehand. I'm not saying who, as you said, Eric, and we just didn't have any.
Yeah, well, let's just say someone probably went in there during daylight hours in their country while it was, sleepy time in Canada.
Right.
There's only a few locations where that is possible, but they're definitely in the Southern Hemisphere, and we'll leave it at that. That at least limits our options to looking at only about 2 billion people. So I don't know who it would be. We could potentially limit a little further. Call me Sherlock Holmes, but who has access to our social media accounts, knows our passwords, and knows how to get in there?
It does shorten it a little less than 2 billion.
Yeah, it's a little bit less than 2 billion. I think it starts with the same number and then finishes right there, but we'll figure it out one day. So,
Eric, as an aside too, I like Brandon, our editor. Shout out to our editor. It is wilding out of control here. You hear he's gonna mask it, but he can't mask everything. Do you hear these sirens? They're after us.
I tell you what, this is only rough when we have a guest, because, well, it's actually rough for Brandon no matter what. So because he's got to go through and decide, okay, I got to mute Omar while Eric's talking here. We can't hear them both laughing. Whatever, that's all good. We got the siren. We have a guest though, and unless they're recording their own audio, Omar has to preemptively mute himself to remove the constant threat of the law shutting us down that steps on the audio of our podcast guests, unfortunately. But that's why we pay Brandon the some bucks. I'm not gonna say the big bucks, because
some bucks, like Subway dollars,
yeah, some bucks. Sorry, Brandon, we're out here turning down deals from mega corporations. So so far we haven't leveled up your pay. But the good news is we are creating more work for less pay, which is just a more efficient thing at the societal level. It's kind of like, everyone's chipping in. It takes a village to have a depression. So yeah, thanks, Brandon.
And Eric, I'll say that we will get it started, but hey, let's face it, it's a duo. The banter's going to be there. We've already weeded out. We've called the herd, so to speak, of those not interested. So whoever's left are the people that enjoy it. I do want to read the reviews, because I do want to give respect to the individuals that take the time. There's a lot of different witty comments, but YouTube, I'll read one or two, Eric, and then quickly, Apple iTunes, you can leave a review there. We do tend to read them out loud. We try our best, maybe one every other episode. So here it goes. Last episode with Connor Heffernan, someone said this. I just love how some of the people write out the comments. Sammy said, I just want to say this is my favorite podcast. It's the only podcast I listen to, so by default, it has to be my favorite. But even if I listen to more, I think it would still be in the top spot.
That's amazing. And I appreciate that. That's an element of respect and realism. And that's exactly what we're going to bring you today in this episode. And I realize we should get onto the episode immediately, because we're playing fast and loose with our followers right now. We're bantering for 10 minutes and then asking for a rating and review, knowing that they actually have to suffer through that to get to the part they like. So we're basically just daring people to give us those 2-star ratings. But anyway, let's get into it.
Go.
So yeah, like I said, we talked a good bit about reaching a peak earlier than you actually might, and things that we mistake for the age-related decline in performance, body composition, health, and fitness. And I think we should dive more in on that. Let's talk about the actual data out there, and then we can talk about what you can do about it. Because the reality is, Omar, and I can tell you this, I'm starting to experience it and understand it as someone who's approaching 40. I'm a year and a half away from essentially making no gains and just having my hair fall out on a day-to-day basis. So now, anyway, seriously, now that I'm approaching 40, I notice there's 2 types of posts. They're very polarized that go on social media from older lifters. There is the things don't work like they used to. Woe is me. I'm doing the best I can, and I'm doing great for someone my age. Types of these conciliatory elements of fatalism, elements of nihilism. And let's be honest, most of the time they're not posts. People like this are actually people who talk to you in person because they don't use social media. And they just basically are telling you that, yeah, it's good now, young person, who just means that you're younger than that person. But just wait until blank and then it's all downhill, right? And then the other post is definitely made by the older lifters, and I count myself among them, who are on social media because they're trying to stay hip. And they think that hip actually still means hip these days, and it's actually still 1975. It's not. And they're posting about, hey, age ain't nothing but a number. Look at this PR I just hit. Look how I'm still doing great. Look at my amazing physique. I just learned what the word, thirsty was from my daughter, and I'm now doing that pose. That type of thing, right? But nary is there a post in between. And the reason why is because they're fighting against, I'll speak in the first person here, so you don't think I'm calling you out without actually knowing that I'm a part of the this existential crisis community. They're fighting against the reality. Because the reality is that all athletes will take one final L to a gentleman named Father Time. And there's no way getting around that. That is going to be the final L. However, while that is true, again, realism mixed with optimism, that's what we do here at the Cult, we don't want to let that happen earlier than it should. And I think when you get stuck in the former polarized response of, that fatalistic or nihilistic thought about aging, the woe is me, that leads to what? It leads to the loss of motivation, which leads to the loss of hope, which leads to the loss of effort in the kitchen and the gym, or sometimes, and maybe even more often than just simply a loss of effort, the cessation of training, which then means that decades earlier than your potential peak, you're on the downhill slide. And that's not good, because then you're experiencing these so-called quote-unquote age-related effects in your 30s, 40s, or 50s, when perhaps you might actually be able to be still improving at that point. So that's the preamble, Omar. How am I doing?
Eric. Yes, I'm biased in your favor, but I could tell you're going to absolutely crush this episode. Let me just say really quickly, I want to give a shout out to Alan Thrall. I call him that now that he's less than 200 pounds. We know if you're less than 200 pounds, such as myself, you're not actually a real man. So anyways, a coach said it one time, so it's a real thing. The line he said, because you'll say to some of that nihilism and whatnot, his response, which I like, he's similar category. He's still trying to improve himself. He has a family now. He has other commitments. But the line he says, Eric, I just want to open up and go, man. He says, "What are you going to do? Not train?" Right? Like we're like when you're faced with this uncertainty and all these things, and it's a little bit of entropy setting in the system, like what you can or can't do, what your overall potential. But the question is kind of, what are you going to do? He says, "Not train," and I love that.
Yeah, I would say a viable option is to not train, still go to the gym, hang out near the juice bar, do a little bit of cardio, and then anytime you see someone who's strong, let them know how strong you used to be. I think that's a viable option. It still feels good. You're still part of the lifting community.
Right.
And hell, Omar, you even made a shirt about those guys. So I think they're still contributing in one way or another. And we've all met that guy. So absolutely. I think well said. So now that we're diving into this topic, let's first talk about let's empirical hard facts. Because I know some people are thinking, Eric, you're turning 38, you're leaning on platitudes, you're losing your scientific edge. You're basically Al Bundy, except instead of talking about your high school football days, you got your hand in your belt loop and you're talking about your lifting days, And I promise you I'm not, because we actually have some hard data that does compare middle-aged individuals to younger individuals. And they've been recent studies. So these are pretty high quality studies. There's actually 3 I'm thinking of. They're published, I think, since 2017, most of them in the last 3 years. The first one is by Fernandez and colleagues, okay? They took trained lifters and split them up by age. So they had one group that was 21 to 25, and the other group was described as middle-aged resistance trained males from 35, which may or may not include Omar and definitely includes me, to 54, okay? So that is definitely within the age range where you start to hear, lifters saying like it's all downhill. You definitely be smaller at this point, weaker, or at the very least injured and salty about it, right? So what they did was they measured the rate at which perceived exertion, heart rate, power, and velocity changed intra-session, so within the same session, when basically doing a German volume protocol. So 10 by 10 sets of squats at 60% of 1RM. And, I guarantee you there's going to be someone out there who goes, yeah, that would absolutely body me today in my 30s, 40s, or 50s, but could have crushed it in my 20s. Well, that's not what the study found. In fact, there were no significant differences between groups at the rate at which RPE increased between sets, heart rate increased between sets, just the rate. Of course, there were differences in heart rate because you got different ages and max heart rate changes as you age, but power, velocity, perceived exertion, and heart rate all changed set to set at a similar rate in this study, which tells you something that at least like your current level of fitness can be maintained even into your 50s if you are maintaining your current level of fitness, right? It's kind of it's a chicken or egg thing, which we're going to see time and time again as to what leads to what. So that's intra-session, Omar. We've also got inter-session. So, okay, that's great. So I can still perform well, but Eric, what you don't know and what this study doesn't cover is that I'll be wrecked for 5 days if I was to do something like that. But back in when I was in my 20s, could have done that every day. Maybe. Or maybe that's just your rosy colored glasses. So follow-up study to this, well, it's actually not the same researchers, but a very similar study, but looking at the inter-session recovery. Gordon and colleagues compared 18 to 30-year-olds to 40 to 59-year-olds, again, trained male lifters, and they looked at the 48-hour time course for recovery of force production, perceived soreness, swelling on ultrasound, which is a more objective measure of, say, soreness, if you will, or muscle damage inflammation. And then they looked at markers, so biomarkers for muscle damage and inflammation after 8 sets of 10 on an isokinetic leg extension protocol. So a very similar amount of volume. Just for those who don't know research lab-based training, an isokinetic dynamometer, it's a leg extension that basically moves at a fixed rate, meaning you put forth max effort, and as you get tired, you're just putting forth a little less force. So doing 8 sets of 10 means that not only are those sets roughly to failure, but at maximal effort, that means every single rep is the hardest you could put out. So 8 sets of 10 on isokinetic leg extension, that is going to jack you up. But interestingly, there were no significant differences between this group of 18 to 30-year-olds versus this group of 40 to 59-year-olds in terms of inflammation, muscle damage, perceived soreness, swelling, or force production. So those things were covered at a similar rate. So again, it seems to indicate that if you keep at it, as you move towards this supposed era where it's all downhill, you can maintain that same level of fitness and recovery between sessions. Now, Omar, you may have noticed that those were both studies on trained males. Am I leaving out women? Well, these studies did, and shame on them. No, I'm just kidding. But we do have other research that does look at women, and this is an important distinction because women have different changes in their physiology as they get older. They go to being postmenopausal at a certain point. And menopause is an important physiological distinction between late-stage, middle-aged men and women. So when women stop producing estrogen, that's theorized to potentially have a larger impact on them than in men who are at a similar age. Because for those who don't know, estrogen is often villainized, to which Dr. Ben House alluded to in our testosterone conversation, like testosterone good, estrogen bad, this make you man, this make you woman. Stupid. It's way too oversimplified. And in fact, estrogen has anabolic properties, anti-catabolic properties, and it protects against muscle damage. So you would think that postmenopausal women who are no longer producing the same amount of estrogen would be more fatigable and would not recover as well. But That's not exactly what this study found. And it does seem that the repeated bout effect, the effect of having trained for decades, has a larger impact that dominates any difference that might be observed from these hormonal changes. So, anyway, last study we're going to talk about, Romero Parra did an almost exact same study design as to these other ones. They compared women who were on average 52 years of age, who were postmenopausal, 52 plus or minus 4 years, to a eumenorrheic women. So that means they're still having the menstrual cycle, on average 29 plus or minus 6 years old. And they had them do a 10 by 10 times 60%. Again, they love the German volume training out in these studies. Protocol, and then they compared the same style, 48-hour recovery time course, and they looked at markers for muscle damage, inflammation, and of course force production, so their performance. And again, there were no significant differences between these 52-year-old on average women who were no longer producing the same level of estrogen and their younger counterparts who were still having menses. So that's good stuff. And I think that would surprise most people that, when we're talking about people 40, 50 years old, even in their 50s, if they have been training and they are trained and training hard still, they're not actually that different from a younger version of themselves.
Eric, that is some phenomenal news. We have to talk about the cult, though, right down to the cult, right down to the people. We have to talk about the individuals we tend to see at the gym, on the treadmill, those, let's call them weekend warriors who used to, bench 4 or 5 back in the day, that are maybe in their 40s and 50s, like, oh, my body doesn't work like how it used to. And let's come up with some theoretical explanations why we see certain portions of the population at that stage where they're talking about the glory days. The two things I just wanted to mention, because when you said that, and you said train lifters, the basically equivalent recovery times, despite the difference in the age of the populations, I was thinking 2 different things. I want to bring up the biopsychosocial model overall, just to say that some of the individuals that are probably older, what I've at least have observed, their responsibilities outside the gym have grown tremendously since they were in their youth. We were just talking actually before the podcast, like first, let's say 10 years ago, 15 years ago, like being in high school where, hey man, you want to lift? You just lift, you go home, whatnot. I got my exam. I'm worried about am I going to ace this exam, right? It's like now you're an extremely busy individual. We both have, our careers, all these, a variety of different things, not coming up with excuses, but your life gets more complex over time. So I think the worldview of how someone regards their training, both the priority or their ability when they say to recover, it's not what they do at the gym, it's outside of it where they're feeling stressed, they go to the gym, they're thinking about 10 different things. But also a factor I do want to talk about, and that is when many individuals talk about how we're dynamic, right? Like we're adaptive people, right? Or like you could do anything, like you just throw the stimulus. You tend to see a narrowing of focus, I think, in some populations at the gym. And what I mean when I say that is I bring up, the middle-aged powerlifter that is chasing numbers that basically the result of the last 20 years of what they've chosen to do and what not to do has led to particular results in their body. Oh, I got an achy hip, my back is hurting, my elbows. And I'm not saying powerlifting caused this. I'm saying that all the factors associated with their lifestyle choices in that course of time has led to a particular result. And so there's a narrowing almost of focus where you become singular. Oh, like this was my sign of virility, or like, how manly, whatever these approximations that we use to evaluate ourselves. But people almost, I would say one of the issues is sometimes individuals can get set in their ways where they're chasing a former glory from times past with the wrong approach. And what I mean when I say that, when we talk about being adaptive individuals, I got to bring them up just real quick again, because I want to hear from you what you think the discrepancy between, like, theoretically, it should be the same in recoverability. And I think that's absolutely the case. But we do notice, you know what I'm saying, Eric, like these, within the population, these people. Chip Conrad, are you useful? I got to bring it up again. But when he went over, one of the most impressive things, Eric, are you comfortable sharing his age? Because I quite honestly can't remember, but I thought it was like 45. What is it?
I want to say, and Chip may not like me anymore for saying this, but at this point in time, he may have crossed that 50 mark now that we're in 2021. Okay. So I bring this up for a reason, Eric. And that is, to me, one of the most impressive feats of athleticism I've seen in the last few years, because I know my knees would absolutely explode simultaneously, both of them at the same time. So this is 4 years ago. Let's just say Chip was 45. All right, let's give a rough estimate. He has a video on YouTube of him basically doing a depth jump at the beach
but from a height of probably 20 to 30 feet to sandy bottom. Now, granted, it's going to change the impact. I could tell you this, however, right now, what I'm trying to say, what he talks about, are you useful, the idea of bounding, rolling, like all these dynamic movements. We think we're in this, once again, dynamic environment just because we do a 3x5, like we squat and we deadlift, and we notice a lessening of our abilities, but it's because we're not sharpening those tools. Like when I saw Chip do that, and I saw how pliable he was in person. I'm not trying to be funny when I say that, but his movements, and I was thinking to myself, like I have my buddy Mike, you met Silent Mike. All he's done for the last decade is kind of powerlifting, big compound movements. And when I say it's made him tighter, I mean he chose not to do other things, and so it's as if they have not been stimulated. So in order for an adaptive process to occur, you actually have to give something to adapt. And him doing that depth jump at the age of 45 from a significant height that I could tell if you this right now, if I did it just cold, it would not end well for me, is one piece of the puzzle that I'm thinking of when we have these conversations or we talk about certain portions of people where it's like, oh, it doesn't operate like it used to. It's like, well, yeah, you jacked up your elbow, you jacked up your hip, you jacked up your back. You never really address these things. You're still repeating the exact same systems you used to do before, expecting a similar result, and it's not happening. And now you're just down this cycle, down this like rabbit hole of which nothing good is ever going to take place. So, Eric, a long-winded tangent. I'm just wondering what you think between what those studies showed and maybe what we tend to see, what we tend to observe in gyms.
Oh, not a tangent at all. I think this is exactly what this episode promised. I brought a hint of optimism, and now you're bringing some realism. And I think it's actually a really, really good point. So you gave a couple examples of older lifters who I think we can all think of archetypes in our own life if we've been in the community of lifting long enough. The power lifter who is chasing the glory days but is actually on the decline and can count more injuries than PRs in the last few years, right? Yeah. You can find them on in person sometimes, or you can find them on social media quite easily. And then the example of someone who just seems to be defying age. And I think Chip Conrad's a great example of that. And bro, like that's only one of a myriad of examples of how he shows just how physically capable he is. Like the dude is a national level Moz wrestler. For those who don't know what that is, picture you've got a fixed board separating two people, and they both sit down in kind of like a sit and reach position, put their feet on the board, and they're both grabbing a dowel, right? And they're trying to pull the other person over or off the dowel. You're in a sit and reach position. So you're in a long muscle length position for your lumbar and your hamstrings, and you're pulling as hard as you can and jerking and going from low to high velocity, high rate of force production, laterally, multiplanar directions. There's a lot of hamstring injuries in this sport. The dude's national level at his age, okay? Not only that, I know for a fact that he has hit some of his best weightlifting and powerlifting totals, because yeah, he competes in both, folks. And also he won, in his 40s, and also just a couple of years back, maybe last year, he actually won the lightweight division of a strongman competition. Man. So the dude is one of those wiry muscled, high mobility, high strength, and also quite powerful and agile people. And I will say that he has always had a training philosophy for as long as I've known him, since way back in 2006. And even before that, I know this has been his approach of having a very wide envelope of functionality under the umbrella of strength. So, I mean, this dude can get busy with kettlebells, Indian clubs, body weight movements, big three, snatch and clean and jerk, and anything that strongman wants to throw at you and more. And he's always been about that. And I think, sure, the guy might have had a predisposition for that. He's clearly just kind of naturally mobile. But at the same time, he could have very easily specialized in one of those, and he would probably have less functionality. So I think the key difference between these two archetypes is that the latter, if we're using Chip as kind of an extreme example of it, is someone who knows how to move laterally. And I think that is a real concern. So here's the optimistic part. Here's the realism part to what I talked about before. What these studies don't capture are the middle-aged individuals who saw the study participant information sheet, recruitment flyer, and went, no, I don't do squats anymore, right? So we're obviously seeing people who consented to the study. We're not seeing how many people who are older looked at the study and said, I don't want to do that, or I can't do that, or I'm not willing to commit to it. So there is going to be some selection bias. That's unavoidable, but it does need to be said. And it's hard to say if this is an effect of age or an effect of time. So how do we measure injuries in quantitatively in exercise science research? We do it per 1,000 hours of training. We know that weightlifting and powerlifting have somewhere between 2 to 5 injuries per 1,000 hours. Bodybuilding is about half that, depending on which study you look at. Strongman and Highland Games are substantially more than that, which makes sense considering you have more domains. It's a head-to-head competition, and it's got a lot more variability in the way the movements can affect you. So that's probably good for making you resilient, but also puts you in a position where you need to be resilient. So of course, there's going to be a higher injury rate. Ironically, when I was doing strongman training, I felt probably the most resilient, but also the most at risk. So it's a very kind of interesting dynamic there that I think people struggle to really conceptualize when they're thinking about injury risk. But anyway, if you're a strength athlete and you've got, even let's say you're in the middle of that, you get about 3 injuries for every 1,000 hours of training, and let's say you train 8 hours a week, we're talking about probably getting injured at least once per year. So here's one other difference of a master's lifter versus a lifter in their 20s. One's been lifting 20 years longer. So that's a long time to accumulate injuries. And like you said, Omar, if maybe your attitude or your disposition towards lifting is one where you don't know how to make lateral shifts, you struggle to stay motivated, or maybe you're really just kind of have this kind of narrow view of what it means to succeed, or let's just say maybe you're not that resourceful, or you just don't know how to avoid injuries or how to deal with them, or you're injury prone, you might be someone who theoretically could have the same improvement over time, or theoretically might have that same recoverability or fatigue resistance, but just has a little too many chinks in their armor at this point because of the accumulated years. And I think that really does need to be said. And then other more qualitative factors that have to do with life demands, it may be far harder because of the reality of your life at a certain age to put forth the same effort required to maintain that fitness. So what I don't want to do in this episode is to not acknowledge the realities of life and the realities of putting in decades of work in the iron game, and suggest that just because we have these theoretical acute studies, that invalidates those things. Because it doesn't. Because it is harder as you start adulting to keep committing to something that is ultimately a hobby, even if you love it and you dedicate a large portion of your life to it. And it is harder to keep training hard when you've had another 2 decades of time to accumulate injuries. And those aren't actually effects of age, but they are they're inseparable from the reality of life and aging. So I think those are really good points. So those are my thoughts on that, Omar. Now, what might be helpful? Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Can I share a recent anecdote for myself, because the NDA that we signed, I won't say what happened, but we signed an NDA. There's gonna be something. Eric's gonna be a part of it. But I do want to just share a little bit about self-care, just the concept that what do you do when something happens to you? And that's why I'm very grateful for the network, like Eric, anyone that I could reach out to. But just the idea that we joke about, this entropy in the system, that if you don't address certain things and you keep moving forward, as Eric said, 20 years of training, you start having these aches, pains that are never addressed. And then what do you do from there? I just want to say very quickly, I think the idea of not catastrophizing an injury overall or setback is very, very useful. But there comes a time and a place where merely working through it isn't the case. And what I mean when I say that, Eric was there. Again, we signed an NDA, so January, we could talk about it. But basically, Eric, recently I had to do 9 workouts in 3 days. So just sharing a little bit of a personal example here, right? So worked up to deadlift single, overhead press, like 80%, like for AMRAP, a lot of different demands, but also things, that's why I brought up, when you impose these new demands upon yourself, and me, I was just doing my bread and butter strength training, so I had to do some jumps, so vertical jumps, broad jumps, more power-based training, so things like plyo push-ups. And Eric, I went from doing 0 plyo push-ups because I had to do multiple takes with the camera. I ended up doing 35 in a row. The first 10 felt great. And as I kept popping it, anyways, needless to say, I'll show the video here. This elbow completely straight and fine. This one already. So basically, what happened? One elbow. You noted if you saw my weightlifting, lifting in general, kind of low velocity powerlifting, it doesn't extend all the way. Cool, no problem. Anyways, from doing triple the amount of work in a wide variety of different ways from before, the elbow got jacked up. And Eric, of course, what? So first day, not going to catastrophize it. I can't straight it. Like it is, when I say it's crooked, like there's an extra 15 degrees loss of ROM. That's no problem. Joints inflamed, whatever. A few days later, move it around. Of course, what are you going to do? Hey, man, like, hey, positive mindset. Of course. Like that's what I'm doing, right? So here's the thing. I wait an entire week. I begin loading it slowly. Like, hey, like, let me just do some curls, extensions, like move, elbow flexion, and extension. Makes a ton of sense, right? Wrong. It actually got even tighter. I'm not even joking here. Where I had impacted it with whatever I did so poorly that merely moving around caused an extra loss of function without context, right? So just doing what I normally did, or like just getting blood flow into the joint, just the general piece of advice that tend to work 90 or 95% of the times. Anyway, shout out, we had him on before, Dr. Sam Spinelli. We had a video consult. He took a look at it. We did a few different things, worked on some rotation, and luckily it took 2.5 weeks before I was able. Essentially, I can't quite extend it all the way. But if I didn't have this consultation where it took about 10 days of me, it getting progressively worse, me trying to do things, just think about that, encapsulate that one example for lifters, knee, it doesn't matter, but you don't address it and then you try and move forward. And that's why I said that narrowing, I'm not sure if you've experienced this before, or observed it with people. That's why I think one of the reasons where, like my back, it's something that's never addressed. And then the scope of what you try and do just shortens. Well, I guess I can't squat. So instead, what I'm going to do, I'm going to belt squat now. And then eventually can't belt squat, you move to the leg press. So these things just accumulate over time. And instead of being this robust individual that is adaptive to these new demands, you're kind of succumbing by not being proactive and not practicing self-care. And I'm not trying to throw shade against anyone. Like, think about it. I had immediate access to a stellar physiotherapist. They could just look at it and like fix me right up, right? So I recognize the privilege within that. I'm like, hey, like, just, oh, kid, you have no money. You go to college, like $80, go see a physiotherapist. But there is a time and place. All I'm merely saying, as Eric said, the more time you invest in this, I think there's other considerations outside of just the lifting session that has to go into your longevity. And that's something I personally experienced myself, where once again, I was like, hey, like, Eric, it's all good, bro. Hey, I can't straighten it. Oh, biceps, triceps, we'll move it around. But hey, I'm not catastrophizing it. Like, walk it off, champ. There's a time and place for everything. And I think knowing your limits can be something very powerful, and knowing when you need help then too, quite frankly.
Oof, I gotta share story time too, because I've had a very similar one. So we'll go back to 2016, a slightly younger, but still relatively old. I mean, we're still in my 30s. So I had at this point in 2016, 12 years of accumulated, wear and tear. Not that that's really the way the body works, but I've had some dings. Okay. For those who are big Helms heads, you'll know that I got FAI surgery in 2017 in February, because I'd been, since 2013 I've had issues related to that. And the way I was working around that up to this point around 2016 was I could really only front squat and just to about meet depth. So I was in Florida finishing my final study for my PhD, which involved 3-day per week training, bench press and squat, for the awesome participants who volunteered from FAU. I'm working there with Dr. Zerdos and his team. So I was in the lab 6 days a week, 5 to 8 hours a day. And we were able to get 21 people through this study with a couple dropouts, so a total of 23, done in a little over 12 weeks. So those are long days, and we have basically, if you want to imagine what the FAU Muscle Lab looked like at this time, it's a classroom that has been converted to just a training place. So it's got 5 ER racks, okay, which are combo racks. They can be converted to squat or bench press. They look a lot like what you'll see at a powerlifting meet, and sometimes they are used in powerlifting meets. So I'm bouncing between, at any given time, having 1 to 5 participants, most of the time like 3 simultaneously, go through this. And we're trying to basically make this as an enjoyable experience as possible for the participants. So they're not loading their own plates. We're loading their plates. And then what do we do once a day between, training our participants? We train ourselves. But this isn't a commercial gym. What do we have access to? A combo rack and some dumbbells. So most of my training at this point consists of bench, front squat, bent over rows, chin-ups, and then with the dumbbells, I'm going to do some, like curls, overhead extensions, and that's pretty much it. So what happens for me loading plates 6 days a week for other people, basically spotting and loading for a powerlifting meet every day for 8 weeks straight, 6 days, not every day, 6 days a week.
Crazy.
Exactly the same thing that happened to you, Omar. Is I already have limited elbow extension on both sides, just naturally. My left arm got such bad, like elbow tendonitis, that it got to the point where I could barely get it past 90 degrees of elbow flexion. So here's the shitty thing. Think about it. Because I can't back squat,
Right.
what else can I do? Well, I can't hold a rack position anymore like that because being too bent also hurt my elbow. So now I can't front squat. I also can't curl. I can't row and I can't bench, and there's no other equipment there. So the only thing I was able to do for this time period was good mornings and nothing else. Because I couldn't RDL because one arm wouldn't straighten all the way. So I went from being able to do like the big three, except for front squats in place of squats and all my accessory work that you can imagine with dumbbells and body weight, to literally just being able to do good mornings and calf raises for 2.5 weeks. That's about how long it took for mine, doing nothing to get better. Because at first I was like, I'll just work around it. I started doing BFR, really light load stuff. I started just doing limited range of motion bench, like just kind of like just pausing right before lockout. And I went from having a little less extension to a little less extension to eventually looking like I'm a professional arm wrestler. So yeah, I've been there, and I didn't have the tools to know what to do. And like you, also have a lot of connections in the fitness industry. I have that advantage, that privilege, and I was able to connect with a doctor of physical therapy and get help, and I was okay. But yeah, it is 100% something that we have to consider. So we talked about the fact that I had to get hip surgery, and I had this pretty bad elbow thing that could be classified as an injury. Each one of those times, of course, what goes through your head as you get older is this still worth it? Do I want to keep going? Or do I want, at least, do you think about, I'm going to limit what exercises I do, or I'm not going to push that hard, or I won't go as close to failure, or I got to limit my volume. And those accumulate over time. We've also joked about when I had a neck injury, Omar, and we were joking about getting into a bar fight, and I was like, all right, but if I get hit once...
It almost happened, and the fact that Eric was down to step in
down.
shows why you are my ride or die, Eric. I've stated that already, but you showed it. You showed your colors,
If
my friend.
I wasn't able to physically stop them from attacking my boy, I would immediately drop, and the seriousness of the situation would get elevated so much the conflict would stop, as they had to call an ambulance to come get my paralyzed ass. So I knew that either way, I'd prevent you from getting hurt, and I was down. But I do remember that was probably, no lie, the closest I ever came to really limiting what I would allow myself to do. When I had that neck injury, and I knew if I did need surgery that they'd have to literally cut open the front of my throat and like remove a disc or put it in a cage or replace it with a prosthetic one, that really scared me. And I was like, all right, I'm just never going to do anything overhead. So we'll forget about strongman. We'll forget about Olympic lifting. And, I probably shouldn't be maybe doing heavy squats and deadlifts. So pretty much I'm just going to be a bodybuilder who does machine work and some free weights. And I was on the cusp of making that decision. And it was okay because I was like, oh, well, I got bodybuilding coming up for the next little time period, and then it healed. And I didn't, and I came back and I actually did strongman and Olympic lifting after that. So, but I mean, man, if I had recovered just a little bit slower, or one of the surgical consults had been just a little more aggressive instead of asking me to wait 2 months to see if the symptoms went away, and I had gotten surgery, what if, sometimes surgeries are worse than if you hadn't got them. Like look at Ronnie Coleman, So anyway, there is some reality out there where perhaps I am just doing a very limited version of what I'm able to currently do now, and I would not fault myself for that because that's not something we have full control over. And to sustain a peak into middle age and even into like your 50s and 60s, it's 100% possible. But I will say that it takes resilience, overcoming fears, and a little bit of luck. I'm not going to lie, So don't take this as a finger wag at anyone who is not feeling like they're the same as they were in their 20s, but hopefully just a message of, that you can milk this thing a lot longer than you may think. So yeah,
Eric.
So okay, let's get back on track.
So
I think
well
those are really great tangents. Thank you, Omar. Let's talk about some like real world examples, because these studies, like I said, they've got limitations. There's people who don't even participate in them. Let's take some pudding that has proof in it, and we'll spoon feed it to the cult. That's what I'm thinking.
Love
Okay. All right. So last time when we talked about the myths of metabolism, I brought up Dave Ricks and I brought up Marshall Johnson. And I'm sure some people thought like these are cherry picked outliers. Like Dave Ricks is literally called Superman. Marshall Johnson, in his 50s, only lost to Doug Miller by 1 point. Like, yeah, of course people exist. I know that unicorns are out there. They are real. Look it up, folks. But it doesn't mean that I'm a unicorn. Well, let me give you some more realistic examples. All right, so one of the most decorated powerlifters of all time, and she has been on the cult. Go back to our episode where we talked about coaching with Matt and Susie. So Suzanne Hartwig Gary, she started competing in 93. I was 10 years old, okay? And she was 24 at the time, and she has been competing since then, okay? At the age of 50, in 2019, she placed second in Open Nationals, so single ply USAPL Nationals. She was 50, and that was also her best single ply total to date at 447.5 kilos in the 52 kilo division. Look it up on Open Powerlifting, folks. All right. So that's one example. Very decorated, very experienced, very longevitous. That's not a word, but you know what I'm saying.
Now it is. Now it is. Yeah, that's how you introduce a word.
Canon. That's the way it's done. There's also those who aren't familiar. You should be familiar. 2008 Mr. Olympia, Dexter the Blade Jackson. Okay, So again, he won Mr. Olympia in 2008 after being second and third place during the era where a lot of other amazing bodybuilders were going at it in the late 90s and early to mid 2000s. We're talking Battle and Jay. We're talking Battle and Ronnie. We're talking Kevin Lervone, the whole 9 yards. Always being a little bit on the smaller side but having great shape. Well, he sealed the deal, 2008 Mr. Olympia, okay? That was back in 2008, 13 years ago. But in 2020, when Dexter Jackson was 50 years old, and mind you, this is an enhanced bodybuilder. A lot of the people we've talked about, like Marshall Johnson, Dave Ricks, and Susie Hartwig Gary, they're not playing with fire, if you will. They're drug-free athletes, and I do think in general those types of athletes are going to have a little more longevity. And that's not a judgment; it's just kind of the reality that you know what you're getting into. And you can go way back to when we had the late great John Meadows, along with regular of the cult Dr. Mike Israetel, on to talk about some of the concessions you make if you decide to become enhanced. So I'm not trying to be on my natty high horse by any means. But anyway, despite that, Dexter Jackson at the age of 50 in 2020 placed second at the Arnold Classic. Okay, and that is the second most prestigious show to the Olympia, and placing second at that shows you that he is not far from the peak he was at 13 years earlier at the age of 50. So I think that's incredible. So I wanted to give two different examples. Now some people might be saying, Eric, how is that any different than the quote unquote outliers that you presented last time with Dave Ricks and that you presented with Marshall Johnson? Why is Susie and Dexter not outliers? Of course they're outliers, they're champions. And I will concede that these are both outliers in terms of their performance. Of course, they're both the equivalent of world champions. I know Mr. Olympia isn't technically a world champion, but they've achieved the highest honors in their sport. Susie has won USAPL Nationals and World multiple times in the Open and also the Masters division. Like I said, Dexter Jackson has won the Arnold Classic like 5 times or something like that and is also Mr. Olympia. So yes, they're outliers. But what I will say is that by them being at their peak around the age of 50, that's not technically a statistical outlier. The fact that they can still be at their peak. So your peak is obviously going to be lower than Dexter Jackson and Susie Gary. That's just the reality of not everyone gets to be a world champion. We only give out participation trophies to everyone here in the cult, but in the real world, unfortunately, they don't do that. However, being able to keep at that high level until you're 50, I think there's data to suggest that's not as uncommon as most people would think. All right. So, Solberg and colleagues, I think just 2 years ago, maybe last year, published an analysis of over 4,000 powerlifters and weightlifters who were competing at the world championship events or Olympic level, and they looked at what age they reached their peak performance. Okay, and they found some pretty cool results. The powerlifters peaked at 35, plus or minus 7 years, And the weightlifters we'll get to in a second. But let's talk about the powerlifters, because really that's a similar type of demand on the body that a bodybuilder and, of course, a powerlifter like Susie would need to experience. Slow, heavy lifting, high tension levels, not necessarily crazy ranges of motion. Again, we'll talk about Olympic weightlifters in a second. But you might be thinking, hold on, Eric, 35, it's a far cry from 50. I don't know how you can look at that data and say that Susie and Dexter aren't outliers in the fact that they could be at such a high level at 50. Well, let's not forget that pesky plus or minus 7. So now we're going to take a minor statistical detour here. All right. So that is called a standard deviation. And when you're looking at a normal distribution of data, which this was, one standard deviation covers the vast majority of that bell curve. 68%, or roughly 2/3 of the bell curve. But 68% is not the entire bell curve. In fact, it leaves a lot of lifters unaccounted for. A third of them, in fact, if you want to be exact. So let's talk about, because honestly, it's less likely that you will be exactly the mean than you will be within one standard deviation of the mean, because that's a collection of these 4,000 individuals. So that means most people are going to hit their peak between 28 to 42 years old. But what is an outlier? An outlier is typically someone like 3 or 4 standard deviations over the mean, all right? So going 2 standard deviations from the mean, now we're covering 95% of people, and we're capturing most of that unaccounted third of lifters that weren't taken up in that first standard deviation. So if we go 2 standard deviations over that mean, that's 49 years old, okay? That means it's not uncommon at all, and is not a statistical outlier to be at your peak, reaching it, or maybe sustaining it, right around 50, just like Susie and just like the Blade. So I think it's important to note that there are a lot of lifters out there, and we have data on this, who again, probably by some combination of smart programming, lateral moves, being resilient, and absolutely a little bit of genetics and luck to have the ability to get there, who can be at their best as they approach 50. And I think that is a very reasonable proposition that is supported both by anecdote and data to say. So, next time you're thinking, oh, I'm in my 40s, or hell, I'm even in my 50s, that is absolutely not a death knell to your ability. Now we're not just talking about like metabolism or body composition or these kind of more obscure metrics. We're talking about how well you stack up in the open class if you get on a bodybuilding stage or a powerlifting platform. You could still be at your best, or maybe even still approaching it. And again, a peak, importantly, is kind of like, it can be artificial, because you talked about this earlier, Omar. There's a big difference between starting lifting at 40 and starting lifting at 20 and now being 40, right? You're going to get better no matter what. Even if you are past your theoretical peak and you start training at 45, you're absolutely going to be stronger at 55 versus 45, like in probability. Like if we had to guess, I would put money on the fact that you're going to be stronger 10 years after you start lifting, unless you start lifting at a really late stage of life and you've got a lot of other potential health complications. So anyway, that's kind of the big summary. That's the take-home message. I think it's very reasonable to expect even just one standard deviation over the mean to be in your 40s and still kicking ass, if not your late 40s, maybe even early 50s. That's absolutely not an unreasonable proposition, or even a goal, I would say, for the average lifter.
Eric, it's time to lift every single person up, because I think you did a fantastic job once again. There might be, the pessimists, because we said we're realists here. It's like, oh, Eric, normalized distribution, interesting. Okay, 35, average. Cool. It's like, well, does that not mean roughly about 50% of the people are less than 35? Can I just address the individuals that might state, well, you don't know what category you're part of? And I would answer, there is power in that uncertainty, because no one knows that, right? And I do think the first person, it was entertaining to train with him, Greg Knuckles, what I would call, he would probably consider himself mildly optimistic, but with his training or like the goals or everything else, that it's almost like Pascal's wager, where it's like, well, is there really any benefit in thinking that you're fragile, that you're already past your prime? Is there any potential conceivable benefit other than, be realistic, bro, in terms of the things that you can or can't achieve? Like, this is a pipe dream then. Like, you're 30 or 35, you really think you're going to get stronger? You don't know unless you apply yourself. And when I do honestly think this, when you leave that room of doubt, it can actually start to creep into every other aspect of your life, and it can become pervasive. And I just want to share that only because you and myself, I think lifelong lifters develop one of the unspoken traits, I think, of successful lifelong lifters is they do develop a sense of robustness and resiliency along the way. It could hit you. So the first time I remember this, I was 25, where I had 25, 26 when I wrapped up my knees first time ever. I think I shared this with you, and it was my first acute injury, so like a back injury where I try to squat 515, so like 15 pounds more than I ever squatted. But with reps, of course, it adds 100 pounds. So this should only be like RP8. Never mind, I've never done it before. Didn't set the pins right, so I couldn't bail on it. Was low bar, so I also couldn't dump it. Terrible situation. Wouldn't recommend it for anyone. I basically had to do an absolute ATG squat to get it off of my back. Not a fun time. Anyways, some of us have had a face artificial fragility. What I mean when I say that is these demands imposed upon us was like, wait a second, now you can't squat, like your back is really aggravated. It's not like it goes away in 3 weeks, so you walk it off. You have to address this early. I think sometimes you could be gifted, and I'm not trying to reframe everything. Oh, like this back injury was a gift, but the idea that some of the resiliency that you may have needed 5 years into the future, you need to face right then and there. Like your FAI surgery, what I heard from Eric, and this is to me like the true grit or the heart of a champion or pursuing this as a lifelong lifter. There's elements of gold in that, nuggets of gold, as we would say, Eric, where it's like a lot of people like, oh man, you can't do anything already. Your hip is angry. You know, you need surgery for this. Now you got this other thing happening because you correctly identify. So I think remaining calm is always a good idea, where it's like, well, wait a second. Not tripled, quadrupled. The amount I'm using my body over the 6 to 8 week period is a significant amount more. Something happened. What am I going to do? Framing it as such and then being proactive when some of these acute things occur, I think can really build up, once again, the grit that's necessary for long-term success, but also shoring you up so that when you emerge from that theoretical point, you could get right back to what you're trying to achieve. And I could speak for myself that I will say Chip to me is a hero when it comes to lifting, because that is what I want to do. I will give 2 artificial constructs, if I may, very quickly, because I do want to shout out Sean at Fords, because you met Sean. He's 55. Sean made the choice about 8 years ago. He was pursuing powerlifting for a long period of time. He actually entered it late in the game. Most people don't realize this. Maybe like, let's say 30. So he's been powerlifting 15 years, but he started definitely like probably a decade older than most people do these days. Anyways, had a great run, did it for approximately 20 years, but he did notice over time. So when we take a look at the probability of his peak, that he was kind of running in circles. So he wasn't getting stronger. He was getting more grizzled. He was trying a bunch of different things. He was trying to be adaptive. But that peak may have happened to him. Instead of wallowing in self-pity, like, oh man, like once again, my virility as a human, as an individual, like all these things, like I'm past my prime. He did pivot. He made a lateral shift. He widened his scope of what he was trying to do. So he got into Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, because a lot of people don't know this too. He used to be a Golden Gloves like boxer. He did a lot of boxing. So let me move around a little bit more. Let me move this body. Let me change the demands I'm imposing upon myself. So it's not absolute strength. So I'm lifting now as a vehicle to help with the performance and this other sport. Cool. He started doing BJJ before it was cool. Before all these powerlifters did. Like I'm talking 8 years ago, Sean. So he's a perfect example, I think, of someone that recognized, okay, the time for this particular sport might be over. And that's why Eric and myself talk about the concept of being a lifelong lifter. We have many different disciplines we could pull from. And that is why Eric and myself also know that bodybuilding is the true calling, because you can be competitive into your 40s and 50s. And we know this. But there's another person that I do feel sorry for. And I will just state this. There's a few examples of this. You know, we've all belonged to a variety of different gyms, local, smaller gyms, where you see these people that have been lifting a long period of time. There's this person who is facing setback after setback, also in their 50s. When I joined, so this is 8 or 9 years ago, he was just after his peak. Actually, interesting. Like he squatted. This is impressive. Like 550 or something like that, weighing around 190, 200 pounds in knee sleeves at the age of, let's say, like 44. So very, like, let me be clear. He's an incredibly strong individual. But in terms of what he can do over time, it's lessened and lessened and lessened. Injuries have mounted. He's trying to pursue the exact same thing that he did before. Maybe it's like his vocation. It's powerlifting for him is lifting. Like he can't see anything outside of that. And I don't think that's necessarily even a bad thing, trying to pursue your one discipline you fall in love with, but then managing your expectations or how you allocate your time. Because he's someone that works, Eric, 50 hours plus a week. Where it's like, okay, so maybe we're not going to do max effort, 4 sessions a week. I have an hour and a half every single session. What am I going to do? What can I do to address these problems that keep accumulating? And I'm getting more L's than W's. And I can only speak for those people. And some people might be experiencing that well before their theoretical peak. So before like 35, 40, 50, where it seems like they're getting more L's than W's. I think sometimes that just, it's a pause for reflection in terms of what you're doing, what you're pursuing, why you're pursuing it, and maybe if you can widen potentially that scope. And that is why for me, Eric, I'll say in closing, the Chip is a hero, because this is what Eric didn't share. How embarrassing is this? Chip is nearly 20 years older than me. I did a little Moss wrestling with him. I did once again, my fragile ass, I threw up my back. So that actually was from before, but it definitely aggravated it. We went to get Thai food from a lovely place in Sacramento, and here is this 50-year-old man, limber as hell, walking down the street, and Eric's my boy, so he's gonna walk at my pace. He knows, like, basically, like, don't embarrass me, like, slow that roll, slow that shit down. Like, we're slow strutting here. That's what we're doing down the Sacramento streets. And Chip is walking with so much gusto that I was like, you need to slow your 50-year-old ass down. Okay, I can't walk that fast right now. And that is a beautiful story, because it shows like, this is the wise and man, and this is the young buck that doesn't know any better. It's like you're drilling yourself into a corner here, man.
Well, hey, I was 4% body fat, so I'm happy to stroll slow at that point. And you had just earned to walk whatever pace you wanted, because you had just whooped my ass in Moss wrestling at the cost of your back.
You just said that you compete. Like, I took. Let me be clear, Eric. I was predatory in that moment because my back was already aggravated. I'm like, he just won a bodybuilding competition. Yeah, he's emaciated at this point. He's low energy. He's probably very fragile. Now's the time to strike.
It's the one point where I weighed less than you. But the good news is you Cobra Kai'd me. You swept the leg and at the cost of your own back, so maybe not quite Cobra Kai, but you earned that slow walk. But anyway, no, dude, I think that was perfect. That was exactly what we've been doing this whole episode. I bring the optimism, you bring the realism. It's like, well, here's the thing. Your realism still has a hint of optimism. It's like, it's not good cop, bad cop. It's like good cop, bad Canadian cop. So the cop's still pretty good.
I was gonna say good cop, sexy cop, but we could work on that. Hey, anyone that's reading YouTube, listening, go ahead, comment section below. Propose what our movie title would be. It could be a buddy cop duo where we're not actually part of the system. In fact, we're rebelling against the system. But I'm curious what it'd be. I just came up with good cop, sexy cop. It's like my first thought.
Good cop, bad, sexy Canadian cop. I think that's
okay. Go on.
We're getting there. So anyway, I think, no, you pointed out some really important things. Like, I talked about going above the standard deviation, but yeah, technically, you're just as likely to peak at 49 years old as you are 21, based on this data. But here's the thing. Just because, let's say that you are that person who peaks in your performance at 21, what probably happened? Maybe you stopped enjoying powerlifting and quit, or you got hurt. That doesn't necessarily mean that you aren't happy, or that you didn't find another way to find the same thing you get out of lifting, but another style of lifting, or something completely different altogether. Shout out to Mike Zerdos again on this podcast. We just had him on recently to talk about his experience as an endurance athlete. And he mentioned how the cumulative injuries from him training with gusto, I will say, this is Mr. Daily 1RM squat, led him to actually stop. You could argue he hit his powerlifting peak in his late 20s or maybe early 30s. I don't remember exactly when he hit his biggest total. But cumulative injuries did get him to the point where it was no longer an enjoyable process to lift. He went from like powerlifting to more bodybuilding style to now he is loving, absolute loving, pushing himself really hard in endurance sport and getting better and better at that. So he still has the piece that made him happy, which is the ability to exert himself and progress, but he is just finding a new way to do it. So there's nothing wrong with quote unquote peaking early, so long as you can still find that same thing that keeps you active, keeps you healthy, and still gives you that, never-ending possibility of progression in some form or another, which is essentially what this is all about. So yeah, we're acknowledging the negatives. You might hit your peak at 21, and it wouldn't even be an outlier either, just like the person hitting their peak at 49. But that doesn't have to be the end. And like you said, if we can't know, if this is Schrodinger's cat, why are you going to say that the cat's dead when the cat could be alive? Nobody knows, all right? So just give it your all. And when you age out, even if you're still pretty goddamn young, and then just do something else. Be resilient. Find another pathway forward. So I think that's a great lesson. All right. So what are some things you can do to potentially make sure that you are extending your peak as long as possible? One of the things that I get asked about a lot, because I am a protein researcher, is, well, hey, I've heard that you need more protein to offset quote unquote anabolic resistance as you get older. And that's something, a really good paper came out just recently, and I'm actually reviewing this in Mass coming out in a couple weeks, November 1st. It's by Moore, and it's the title says it all. Protein requirements for master athletes, just older versions of their younger selves. So I think this is a semi-controversial topic in the protein research because a lot of the data is just looking at untrained individuals and comparing them to one another. So the preamble here, I'm not gonna bury the lead. I want people to understand that the kind of view we have of viewing this, hey, there's no such thing as an age difference. There's just differences in inactivity. That's not true. There really are age differences. Because if there weren't, an inactive younger individual wouldn't have an advantage over an inactive older individual. So something's going on, right? Obviously, there's the thing here. But I think a better way to frame it, for the untrained, inactive individuals who are young, it's not an age disadvantage. It's a young age advantage. Your youth allows you to get away with not training and still having solid metabolic responses to meals, not having issues with your body composition changing because you're inactive. But those cumulative years of inactivity will get to you, and your old muscle, if it's untrained, will not be the same as your young muscle if it is trained. And this has been shown in multiple studies where they basically give people who are untrained, they break them up into two groups, and this has been repeated over at least 3 studies I can think of off the top of my head. They give them a workout, and then they give them a protein dose, and they see if there's a difference in the protein dose required to reach max muscle protein synthesis in the older and younger individuals. And the data would suggest that if you're in your 60s and 70s and you're untrained and have been untrained most of your life versus you're in your 20s and 30s, that you might require 50% more protein to get the same level of anabolic response to protein post-workout. So this is what's called the age-related anabolic resistance. Essentially, your muscles become less quote-unquote sensitized to protein to get the same response. And there's a number of mechanisms that are thought to contribute to this. Probably the ones that have actually been empirically evaluated and seem to be relatively well established is that you lose capillary density. So your blood flow to especially your type 2 fibers gets impeded with age. You also see decrements in vasodilation. So that's the actual ability of the vessels themselves to constrict and contract and help deliver blood flow and control that. So blood flow goes down to type 2 fibers, and therefore you see atrophy in them. You also see the loss of satellite cells, possibly as a consequence of this. And satellite cells are basically like muscle stem cells. They branch off and help you hypertrophy. And there are other factors like baseline inflammation is typically higher in untrained older individuals versus untrained lower individuals, which seems to have a knock-on effect at impeding some of the mechanisms that result in higher muscle protein synthesis, like activating the mTOR pathway. So we've got this mechanistic data that suggests why this is happening. And then we have the data itself, which is still pretty mechanistic in nature, where you compare older individuals, you compare younger individuals, take them off the street, they're untrained, you give them a workout, and then you give them some whey post-workout, and you see the younger individuals are getting more out of it. They're more sensitized to their training sessions. And now this isn't just about post-workout nutrition, okay? Because it's important to remember that the way we grow muscle is a series of successive bouts of being in the quote-unquote post-workout state, right? At a gross but still, again, mechanistic level, the balance between muscle protein breakdown and muscle protein synthesis, your muscle protein balance, if that's positive, you're growing muscle, okay? And the way muscle growth works is that if we're untrained in a normal state, we eat protein and we don't eat protein. We have meals, we go into a protein synthesis dominant state and then a protein breakdown dominant state. And then the net balance is typically neutral, okay? And as we age, we also, as we learned from last episode where we talked about aging and metabolism, we get less and less and less active. So unfortunately, we get a little less of just the baseline stimulus of moving in a gravity well on Earth and having less tension on our bodies, and we slowly atrophy, and that's called sarcopenia, the age-related loss of muscle mass. So that's why we tend to start losing muscle in late stage, middle age, into old age, because of that. But the process is the same, whether you're lifting weights or not. You maintain or lose or gain muscle because of eating protein in a state that is either post-workout, where you're sensitized and more of those amino acids are partitioned and incorporated into skeletal muscle, so you grow muscle, or you don't, and they're just used for energy or to maintain your current levels of muscle mass, right? So if we see older individuals and we go, aha, they post-workout are not as sensitized as protein, even if they maintain their activity levels, hey, look at that. They're going to slowly lose muscle over time. And if they do want to try to gain muscle, they're going to have to eat more protein to offset this anabolic resistance associated with age. And that's the dominant narrative. And you can find reviews published as recent as 2016 that I'm aware of, where they say, hey, if you want to get into lifting weights, you want to grow muscle, and you're older, hey, if you're over 60, over 65, somewhere in that range, it's a good idea to consume more protein and higher quality proteins post-workout to make sure that you're not at this disadvantage that we clearly know to exist. But here's the rub. The rub is that this is observed exclusively in untrained adults. Okay? This is comparisons of untrained older individuals to untrained younger individuals. And as I discussed earlier, is this actually an age-related effect, or is it cumulative years of inactivity? Now, let's talk about some other interesting data. So, the Dutch. Why am I talking about the Dutch? The Dutch are some of the most active people in the world. If you look at surveys of activity in the Dutch population, in the age group of 61 to 71 years old, they report an average of approximately 2 hours per day of combined walking and cycling. Okay? That's a very high activity level.
More than me.
Absolutely. And in fact, you're Canadian. This is perfect. There is a comparison in this review by Moore of 3 groups. One is from a study by Yang and colleagues, which is Canadian older adults in the range of, I think the average age was 71. One is a comparison of older adults from the Netherlands, similar age. Again, that's the Dutch. And then one is young adults, I think from the States or the UK. I can't remember which. Now, the UK, the States, and Canada have some of the lowest rates of activity overall, and especially as you get older. So we're looking at 2 very different populations, despite them having similar ages and comparing to them to young lifters. And when you normalize them for having the same amount of protein per kilogram of body mass, you see that the anabolic response is left shifted from the old people. So meaning that if it's right shifted, you have to take in more protein to get a similar response in terms of the actual MPS, muscle protein synthesis response, how sensitive you are to taking in protein. And the Dutch older adults are somewhere between the Canadian older adults and the Western young adults, meaning that it seems most likely that just simply being more active, even in your 70s, can really shift this idea of anabolic resistance to being less. And again, the target population of who we're talking to in this podcast is mostly people who are like, say, 35 to 60, not a 70 and who lift, not a 70-year-old person who cycles and walks regularly. So you'd expect that if you're middle-aged and you regularly lift and you still train hard, you'd be even more similar to having quote-unquote young muscle. So this is really the difference between conditioned and unconditioned muscle in old age, not just an age-related difference. And so I talked about some of those mechanisms, right? I talked about inflammation and I talked about blood flow. And when you look at studies where you actually look at masters athletes, when you look at people who are in middle age and have been training for a while, some of these differences that are observed in older versus younger adults are not there. So there was a comparison of masters athletes, 30 of them, 18 are endurance athletes, 12 are strength and power athletes, and they were on average 51 years old, and they compared them to an age-matched, roughly, they're about 45, age-matched control of inactive middle-aged adults, and they found that they had lower levels of inflammation than the untrained individuals. So that means that masters athletes don't have this chronic, slightly elevated state of inflammation that is comparable to their middle-aged untrained counterparts. They're a little more similar to younger individuals who have lower levels of baseline inflammation, which means they're not going to have those knock-on effects that result in mTOR not necessarily getting stimulated to the same degree, and therefore MPS not being as high. In addition, when we look at the capillary density and vasodilation effects, when you look at, there's a study where they trained older adults for 20 weeks, and they found that capillary density increased, vasodilation improved, and subsequently muscle blood flow was better to muscle compared to untrained older adults following a workout, and they achieved higher net protein balance when they had a post-workout protein feeding. So a lot of the things that we think are truths in nutrition science about this blunted response to protein post-workout and anabolic resistance in older individuals is more accurately described as older untrained individuals in cumulative years of inactivity. So if you are able to keep training and you are not someone who is untrained, this is probably not the case. And I would put money on the fact, even though we don't have direct comparisons yet of longitudinal intakes of varied protein in various age groups and comparing, actual outcomes in hypertrophy, strength, and looking at some of these mechanisms, I would bet based on the mechanistic data we have, some of that population comparisons between the Dutch and Canadian older individuals compared to young, and some of the mechanistic studies where we look at, well, what causes this anabolic resistance, I would put money on the fact that if you're 35 to 60 and you've been lifting for a good majority of your life at the point when you're 60, or even just say the last couple years, I don't think you're going to fall into that camp where you do actually need more protein. There will inevitably become a point where probably you are experiencing higher levels of inflammation or muscle blood flow isn't quite as good, but it's going to be like greatly reduced by the fact that you're training and delayed, so that you're probably not going to experience it until you're in your 60s or 70s. But I'd say if you're middle-aged, I don't think you actually need more protein. But if you really want to make sure you're crossing your I's and dotting your T's, and you want to lean on all of the theoretical potential ways of getting the most out of your protein intake, I often recommend, based upon the Morton meta-analysis that I was a part of in 2018, that you want to take in 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kg of protein. That's 0.7 to 1 gram per pound. I'd aim maybe towards the upper half of that, like the 1.9 to 2.2, around 2 grams per kg or higher protein intake. Probably consume mostly high-quality protein sources. And I would, to err on the side of really trying to optimize things, I'd get roughly 4 or more evenly spread, but probably not more than 6 protein servings per day. Make sure that one of them occurs within a couple hours of training, and make sure that one occurs no more than, say, 2 hours before bed. And make sure it's not a fast digesting protein source. Basically, just not whey. You don't need to go out and get casein or anything like that. Most normal proteins, meats, eggs, etc., yogurts are going to digest pretty slowly. And that'll just really cover your bases. That's maybe a little overkill. You could probably have 3 meals per day based on the applied research. There might not be a benefit unless you're in a deficit of being over that 0.7 gram per pound mark. But if you are someone who's in your, let's say, your 40s, 50s, or even your 60s, and you're like, you know what, I don't know if I'm experiencing anabolic resistance. Like you said, I'm probably not, but I really want to get the most out of my body. Those would be my recommendations.
Eric, you just helped catapult Greek yogurt sales through the roof. Chobani is having a field day at the stock market. They think we're shills for yogurt, but we're just saying it's a very viable. It's friendly for a variety of different reasons. You could eat it basically any time of the day. You think, oh, is this a breakfast food? Like you think eggs. Eggs are kind of a breakfast food. It's an anytime food. It's friendly on the teeth. Tastes great. You can get it flavored. Come on. That's people talk about different sponsors, like proudly sponsored by whatever, Machine X. We're seeking that Chobani sponsorship.
That's right. And don't forget just how hot the gut microbiota is right now.
Ooh, yeah.
In Greek yogurt, ooh boy, it's got all kinds of good stuff for the gut. It's good for quote unquote gut health. Do not share this part of this episode with Dr. Gabrielle Fendero, please. I will get in trouble. But yeah, big shout out to our new sponsor that doesn't know they're sponsoring us, Chobani.
Yeah, I wanted to say, is it phage? How do you say the F-A-G-E?
It literally says it on the package. It says it's pronounced faye.
Faye. Okay, so you know what? See, in Canada, I don't know if we have it. Only when I go down to the States. I'm reminiscing. I'm sorry. I'm getting sentimental. Maybe it's my old age, Eric. But I'm thinking about the Sacramento trip because it is true. There's not a Whole Foods. Again, they're like, corporations suck. I do love the vibe in Sacramento. I didn't encounter a Whole Foods, at least within, the downtown situation. It was an adjacent. It's like a little brother version of it. But they had once again a wide variety. We don't have Chobani. Maybe we do. Someone's gonna correct me. Like, I'm Canadian. I go to my local store, folks, and I get what is supplied to me, but we don't have them. So we don't have like the what's the one? My brother actually orders it online. Oh man, the Icelandic skier.
Oh yeah, skyr.
What?
Yep.
Yeah, yeah. Very. Anyways,
Which is Icelandic yogurt, which is
Yeah.
even sometimes higher protein than the Greek yogurt.
Yeah.
You got to watch out, Greece. All right,
Yeah.
Iceland's coming for you.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. This is the great cultural war of the future. Like this is how wars will be made. It's over who has the best yogurt. And then there's other one like there's fermented ones. Like come on, there's kefir. People here say kefir. It's kefir. Like now we're getting it's a little bit more drinkable. Man, this is the great. How was the Third World War started? Well, there's this little known podcast, Iron Culture, where they posited the yoga, and then suddenly nationalistic tendencies just flared up, and before you know it, here we are, post-apocalyptic dystopian world.
Yeah, Dr. Seuss thought it was going to be the bitter butter battle, but no, it was the yucky yogurt something that means war, but was the Y that I can't think of on short notice.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. Now I will say, just to talk about that information a little bit, what you just spoke about, Eric. I always find it intensely fascinating because one of the tonics that we said, United for all lifters, and paraphrasing once again what Alan said, what are you going to do? Not lift? That there are so many benefits of staying physically active. So I'm not just saying barbell specific. Like we have maybe a slight barbell bias here. We love lifting. We love moving some objects. We like a little bodybuilding here. But I hate that false dichotomy to me between individuals as like, well, I'm pursuing, I want to be a peak performance. Like we joke about that. I'm doing this because I want to hit PRs. I want to be my most muscular or my leanest, most conditioned. I think those are very lofty, very good goals to have overall. We all can relate to that. But suddenly when we can't achieve those, or where it seems like it might be nonsensical for our current place in life or whatever, all a variety of different reasons, that we just give up. Like it goes, it's all or nothing. It's like we go from, I'm about this life to, oh, man, my knee's achy. I think I'm going to start playing some video games. And we hear time and time again across a wide variety of different ways, the metabolism of this, that, like just the concept that staying physically active, especially when you talk about very real detrimental things, because you will age unless you go for the final deload a little early. Sarcopenia, where you refer to it, or all these other things where you're not active, you're not moving around, age-related, atrophy that's occurring, like all these very serious things where we talk about quality of life that I know it doesn't sound sexy to individuals because all of us were guilty of this. Like, oh, like, man, that's 20, that's 30, that's 40. I mean, that is such a future concern. Why do I even need a future proof? And that to me is just the idea when we talk about robustness. I knew it took me a few years of lifting and realize like, I'm going to be doing this for the rest of my life. It's like, okay, so if I wanted, and if you work your way backwards, as we do on the Iron Cult, like we're infallible, we're never wrong. So that you got to just work your way back to anything anyone else states to arrive at why they're wrong. In the same way, it's like, okay, so if I'm going to be about this life for basically all of my life, how can I do it at the highest possible level? So quality of movements and what I'm doing for the longest possible time. And once you start having those considerations, some of your choices start shifting. And one of the ones I could say, Eric, moving into 2022, personally, I'll say this, is the yuckiness factor of winning some of those hypertrophies is going to be a consideration. And then actually leaning down and just dancing below 20% body fat once, I might get 19.8, and then I'm dipping my toe in there, and I'm like, whoop, and I'm out. But all that to say that I have longevity in mind for sure, and that's something I think hopefully all of us, where we love to do this, it becomes a consideration at some point.
That's incredibly well said, Omar. And I have two final words. That's all I got to say left on this one. And I'm gonna start with the one that I don't want you to respond to, so I can immediately move to the next, and then we can just close it out.
Tough.
The first one is that this guy talking about dipping below 20% body fat when he's been perpetually at like 11% body fat for like 2 years now.
Eric, help me.
No. We're going now. The second thing I gotta say is I 100% agree, Omar. And ultimately, it comes down to diversifying your lifting portfolio. So that you have multiple investments, so that you aren't going to get bodied by having a depression, the equivalent of a neck injury or a hip injury or an elbow issue or something like that. I think, like I said, if you really fell in love with one specific avenue of the iron game, I get it. I understand it. Like, all good. But just make sure you're getting a little bit of exposure to other styles of training, from other ways of being, in the gym, or even other ways of exercise. Because if you do unfortunately meet an early peak or even a late peak, you don't want to be the person who only has, like you said, that black and white mentality. It's either an on or off switch. What I'm talking about is that you need to make your amps less like Spinal Tap. It's not about going to 11. It's about getting some 5s and 6s and 4s and 7s so that you have some ability to keep moving forward even in a place of low motivation, and that you can actually just stay engaged enough to figure out how to pivot and diversify that portfolio a little bit and stay in the game. And Omar, that's all that I gotta say left. I think we did a good service, if not for some of our listeners today, for their futures.
Well, as we already stated, Eric, this podcast will outlive us. And it's not even a morbid, to me, that's a beautiful sentiment. And so someone might, here is in the biography of the cult. We make this episode. Someone is a young whippersnapper, male, female, and they listen to this, they're 25. They're like, oh yeah, like this was a good one, but it wasn't as good as like, the one on winning the hypertrophies. And then they come back 40 years from now. Well, we're dead. We're 38 years dead. I don't even have to explain to you what happened. So I'm saying we have 2 years left, but it's 40 years into the future, Eric. And they are listening to this episode now at the age of 65. And the truth in it, there's a beauty that, compels them to tears, where they realize this whole time they didn't even realize they were practicing the right things, but they set themselves up for the best possible future. And the late host help them with that. And so now they're reminiscing on 38 years, they're long gone. Them also, their youth being gone. This is the poignant moment that will allow us to win at the very best, maybe a Golden Globe, certainly not an Oscar, due to some statements that we said about various other actors, such as, I think one of us maybe stated Tom Hanks was part of the reptilian overlord. Just anyway, something that will unequivocally, or our disdain for Scientology, that once again is not cool. If you're part of the academy, you're supposed to bow to those corporate overlords. So it'll be a Golden Globe, maybe a foreign award, like something.
I'll take a Pulitzer.
Oh yeah. You got one. I'm giving
Awesome.
you one. It's like Eric's like, you don't give one, Omar. You got it, Eric.
I don't know. I'll take it. It's all good.
It's something, like Cannes Film Festival. We received a standing ovation posthumously, you and myself. So that we get the things that matter, right? Everyone, Oscar buzz is like because they're paid to mention. Anyways, I do think it was another wonderful episode. It's timely for ourselves in the sense, not that we're thinking of our own peak, but even like I shared, that idea of what happened with the elbow, where if this was my first ever, let's say if I hadn't thrown on my back at 25 or any of these things, this would be a reckoning. Like, oh my God, am I past my peak? What's going on here? So I think there is beauty in humility in recognizing certain theoretical limitations while still pushing ever forward. So I think, Eric, you at the helms, no pun intended. It was a wonderful episode. I want to thank everyone for listening to another episode of Iron Culture, the only podcast that matters. We are going to address some more controversies. You're lucky the banter was only 10 minutes this time, because we will do that in the next intro. You can go ahead, leave a rating or review. We try our best to read at least one every single episode on iTunes, because we are competing. It is a very contentious space, right? That is not a fitness space. It's called health and fitness. But I think when I looked at the top 200, maybe 15 were fitness podcasts. So we're in the top 15 for a fitness podcast. And if you actually take a look at those fitness podcasts, there's like the paleo warrior, barbarian, savage, reclaim your masculinity is like number 84. You're like, okay, that's not that is not an actual fitness podcast. That's called LARPing in real life. You know what I'm saying, Eric? Like they're like, reclaim your masculinity. I'm like, okay, so this guy's definitely having a crisis of faith. Like his wife definitely made a comment or something that just made him spiral out of control. Now he's growing that like musky, archaic beard where he's, reacquainting himself with, what guys used to do back in the day, like carpentry, right? I quit my corporate job. I'm like, hey.
All right, neckbeard.
So we're competing against them. Go ahead and leave a rating review, and we'll catch you back every single Monday from now until eternity. We won't be there, but you'll be there.